Welcome back to our Question Pro Fireside Chats. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, David Boyle, who is actually the director at Audience Strategies and has really built a firm and his career around helping companies put audiences at the center of what they do. That's kind of where the name comes from, Audience Strategies. How do we use the audience at the heart, at the core, to actually direct the strategy and help take companies and brands to the next level? So I think we're going to have a great chat today about how you do that, right? How do you understand the audience? How do you actually come up with strategies around that? And David's really on the forefront of using AI to kind of push these processes forward. And so we're going to get into that and leave that as part of the show as well, right? How do we integrate this kind of the newest technology to make lives easier and get more out of our audiences, get more out of this understanding? So do join us, ask your questions live. We're going to be having a great chat today. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So you're joining us today from London. I know that you're always bouncing back and forth between the States and London. We have you here on the UK side today.
Yeah, with all its grey skies. So I can't wait to get on a plane Sunday back to somewhere with big open skies again.
And where is that on the other side of the pond? Where do you head back to?
In Connecticut. I live on a pond in the woods in Connecticut half the time. So peace and quiet and tranquility over there, albeit lots of guns. And over here, different type of peace and quiet, but grey skies and rain.
I love it. I love it. And I understand that you're a big music fan. So which side do you get better music on?
Oh, music's definitely my passion. So sat by the campfire in the States, there'll be folk music and acoustic stuff. And in London, it's hard electronic music and dark basements.
Yes. Good stuff. Well, you've got the perfect combo, it sounds like. David, tell us a little bit more about Audience Strategies. You know, what's the firm all about? When did it start? Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so it's about 5 friends. We've all worked together for like 10 to 15 years, worked hard in different brands on that mission, right? Trying to put audiences genuinely at the heart of decision-making, not just nice graphs that go in nice presentations, but actually changing strategy as a result of what the audiences want. That doesn't happen nearly as much as you might expect. And after about a decade of that journey in different companies, in record labels and television businesses and luxury goods businesses, we've all gone out on our own now to do this like freelancers under the Audience Strategies banner. And I vividly remember sitting in a pub in England, thinking about like, what should I call this business? And what is it like? What do I really, really care about? And that's where the name came from. I care about 2 things. I care about audiences and I care about strategy, and I want to bang them together. And so that's the name.
I love it. It's such a good story. I mean, I would love at some point we'll have to do an episode on all of the world-changing ideas that happen on a conversation in a London pub, right? I mean, this is another great one to add to the list.
And then I was there, so I set up the company name, and then I bought the URL, and I got the emails like, that's not right, and I put a typo in the URL. So second time lucky on that one. No, not all good things. Not all things that happen in pubs are good. But
okay, so started off with the agile mindset, clearly. Tell us a little bit more about that kind of starting story, the journey there. So the 5 of you kind of got together, came from your different various jobs. And what was that aha moment where you were like, hey, there's something missing in the market here. We should really strike it out on our own and go help brands with this?
I think there's 2 parts to it. Great question, by the way. I mean, I think first, since we'd been in brands trying to do this ourselves, I think we felt like there's so many distractions day to day working inside of a brand, from that mission, from that vision, from that the work that's needed to make that happen. We felt like we were struggling to make it happen, but just didn't have the energy. Like, we needed help, right? And the power of an outsider coming in to help. So we realized that first of all. Yeah, and then secondly, I think we really felt like we could do more if we could help more companies, and that instead of just being in one company all day, every day, if we could just go out and help lots of different people on that journey, that would be much more fun for us as well. So a couple of different things, but yeah, really wanting to have the biggest impact possible and really wanting to try and like fill that gap in the market.
Makes complete sense. And I think it's one of these things that I think it kind of becomes the status quo inside the companies pretty often, right? We're constantly collecting all this data, building out our dashboards. But then we need that kind of outsider thinking sometimes to make sense of it, right? And really turn that data into a strategy. Is that kind of what you saw was happening in the industry? That, hey, we're generating all these reports and dashboards, but you really need somebody with a new perspective to come in and help make sense of it. Is that kind of what you found?
Absolutely. And, I think we were doing a good job when we worked inside companies. I think people who do that, they're doing a good job, but you're focused on the day-to-day quite a lot and serving the immediate stakeholders' needs. And you rarely get the chance or the permission to step back and just really think about how you could have a bigger impact, or not what you are working on, but what you should be working on.
Mm-hmm.
Also, like, what does good look like in the market? What's everybody else doing? And so, there's some of the problems. I think another thing I really learned, I learned it after I started the agency, was going into a client, to a brand, and asking the senior team stupid questions is really important. Like asking them, what keeps you awake at night? What stresses you out? What worries you? What uncertainties do you have? As an outsider, I can do that in a really safe space, one-on-one with senior leaders from huge companies. But if I look, and it's incredibly, incredibly valuable to have them say that, then you know where to point insight in order to have the impact it needs to have. But if I look back at when I worked inside brands, I never wanted to ask my boss those kind of stupid questions because you're supposed to know the answer. And so you never really got to that open, thoughtful place of saying, how could we have the impact we want to have, and what could we do differently? So there's loads of advantages to having outsiders. I used them a lot when I worked in brands, trusted outsiders like me. And I now look back and think, God, I wish I'd used them a lot more.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good point, right? Is that sometimes just being internal, it's really hard to ask those questions because you're kind of already expected to know, or it's like, when's the right time to bring it up, right? I mean, we meet every single week. What makes this week different than the last week for me to start asking all these big questions about what keeps us up at night? And shouldn't I already know that? It's a good point. It's funny, on our last fireside chat, we were kind of talking about how insights teams are really good at like running focus groups and asking questions, but really bad at asking that to their own executives and their own stakeholders, right? Like, hey, we'll pump out all these reports, but have we actually sat them down and asked, like, what are you looking at in this report? Is it helpful to you? Running that own internal focus group. And sometimes you just need an outsider to come in and shake that up, right? And have those conversations and kind of get down to the root of what's making people tick.
And senior leaders will really open up in that environment, one-on-one. We call it the therapist's couch, even though it's done on Zoom these days. But they really open up. They're very thoughtful, actually, when you give them a chance and a safe space to do that. And it really helps to work out how to make insight impactful. It feels like cheating a little bit.
How do you approach that meeting? Like when you go into that therapy session with the executives, what's your approach? What's your line of questioning? What are you looking for as an outcome?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing is to recognize that even if there's a tense relationship between them and the insight team as it is, at the end of the day, everybody wants the same thing, which is the business to be really successful. And so if you step back and just approach it from first principles, which is, what kind of success do you want? What are you worried about in terms of not achieving that success? One of my favorite questions is, what keeps you awake at night? And if you ask those right questions, you really uncover truths that are quite powerful and that have not been heard by the insight teams. Not that they've not been said, maybe, but they've not been heard. And so it's relatively easy. Again, if you create the right space and ask the right questions, it's relatively easy to do that. And the senior executives really enjoy it. Like, they come out thinking this has been an awfully useful chance to stop and think that they haven't had during the day, and they wish they'd made more time for it as well. So I think it's something that everybody wants, but it's just hard to do if you're inside a company. I certainly wish I'd done it a lot more in my career. Certainly wish I had.
It's funny. Sometimes just people need a reminder, right? You've got two ears and one mouth. And a lot of times, if you just ask the questions, people want to talk and they will tell you a lot. And you've just got to sit there and listen and take good notes. So David, I think, tell us a little bit more about this approach, right? So, you're it sounds like this is kind of one of the first stages of how you actually build out kind of an audience strategy. Maybe you can just walk us through, what does that process, what does that approach typically look like for these clients?
Great, yeah. So we call this phase 0 because it's necessary, it's groundwork, but it's not phase 1. It's not real work. So that's phase 0, and we make sure that we invest quality time in that first of all, because the scope that you get, the brief that you get, the questions that you get, they're not the right questions. They never really are. You go through this process and completely rewrite the brief for the project and the set of priorities. Then with a phase, I guess part of that phase and part of the next phase is to say, all right, more specifically, what kind of decisions do you want to make? Like, do you want to change your product or not? Your marketing or not? Your sales channels or not? Like, big picture, like which of these things? And they'll say, no, we don't want to change the product. And I'll say, well, if changes to the product would unlock a new market, would you be open to it? Oh yeah, definitely. Okay, so we better include that in the project then. So what do you want to change? And what budgets do you have? Like, what abilities do you have? What teams do you have to actually execute? Only when you know the decisions and the ability to make decisions and act on them, only then can you design the insight. And so that's usually qual and quant. It's social media analytics increasingly, which is incredibly powerful when it's done properly. And in the last few months, it's now AI as well, which can unlock huge truths about the audience, unmet needs, and your strategic options to meet the audience's needs. So qual, quant, social media, and AI, and transaction data analytics as well. So some combination of that. That's the data part. Then we'll write reports saying, here's where the opportunities are, here's the audiences that you've got now, here's the audiences that we think should be next for you, and these audiences are not yet, and these audiences are never. Don't worry about them. We'll break the audiences out. And then it's strategy sessions to say, all right, this is your now audience. How can you better super serve them or turn them into advocates or whatever the right strategy is for them? Here's your next audience. If you're serious about conquering that, about winning their loyalty, then here's what they want. Here's what they need. Are you willing to do those things? And if so, how? And so it's very much like building a strategy to kind of get each of those audiences to win them.
Interesting. Wow. Okay, there is so much to unpack there. So let's start at the beginning. I don't want to gloss over phase 0. I think a lot of times people just kind of jump right into phase 1, but it actually sounds like phase 0 is a really important part of this process. It's interesting what you said. You know, we can't just take the brief as truth, right? That actually a lot of times the brief is kind of already jumping the gun, right? The brief is kind of saying, hey, we need to do a brand tracker with this sample requirement. We need to ask this customer feedback. And I think we all just kind of take that brief and say, okay, how can we fulfill the brief? So are you actually kind of challenging that? Like, are you kind of saying, you know what, we're not even going to go and give you a proposal on this brief until we have that therapy section and we actually know this is the right brief? I think that's a pretty interesting insight there. Unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I guess that is what we do. Very good point. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it always changes. So I mean, maybe you play along at the start and say, sure, but knowing that it's going to change. Maybe you make that very explicit at the start. I mean, it depends on the client and the relationship. But yeah, I think most people, if you step back, I think most people haven't been in a business that truly puts the audiences at the heart of decision making. Most people think that they have, but haven't really seen it when it works very, very, very well. And so most people, what good looks like to most people is not what good looks like to the best. And so I think there's an educational journey for everybody about what's truly possible. Like, yeah, I worked in the music industry at EMI Music. It was my favorite job ever. I ran the global insight team. And we went on this incredible journey over about 2 years, starting off with people like actively disliking the use of insight or research. And, you know, it was a dirty word around the business because it wasn't done very well and had been slightly abused, as, by the way, it is in many businesses. Over a couple of years, we totally won people over. We had A&R people, the people who work closest with the artists, the most creative people, we had them loving the research and thinking it was incredibly empowering to them, and using it to help make creative decisions, major global artists. I spent time with artists, David Guetta, Katy Perry and others, and talking through the research to them. And when it's done well, you see their eyes light up and they see new ways to go about their business. Snoop Dogg was particularly excited about our insight work. And so when you've seen that, when you've seen it truly shape even the most creative minds and how they go about their business, even the most successful people on the planet, when you've seen it change their minds, you get a different view of what's possible. And you go into a business and say, okay, well, you're aiming here, but really, we could do so much more with this. So there's a journey to go on.
Interesting. I mean, I think that's such a good example, right? With these artists that we all know and love. I mean, I think it really kind of sets the stage for where the discussion started, right? This is not just about kind of creating data and graphs, but it's actually really about coming up with a strategy. And that's where your phase zero comes from, right? It's like, I want to know what actually makes you tick, right? You're asking me for a bunch of slides and charts, but what's the thing that actually keeps you up at night, right? So if we kind of come back to Snoop Dogg and David Guetta and Katy Perry, like the record label is asking you for, give me a bunch of charts and, you know, tell me how we can enter into this market. And maybe it's a little bit more like a marketing strategy, right? How do we distribute? How do we get this stuff out there better? I can imagine that they never asked you for, we want creative input on Snoop Dogg's and David Guetta's songs, right? Like I can imagine that was never part of the brief or the expectation, but that's what you knew actually made them tick, right? That, hey, if we can actually understand these audiences deep enough to help with creative decisions and strategy, now we've won and we've gone much further than anything the brief could have ever told us in the first place.
Yeah, and for me, it comes back to the phrase audience strategy and some language I used earlier, like now, next, not yet, never, audiences. And so like David Guetta is such a good example. He left the room like super clear which audiences he already had and super clear that he wanted to keep those audiences and keep meeting their needs. That was, at the time, that was people who are super into electronic music. And he was super clear as he left the room who his next audience was, which was slightly more pop-focused audiences. And very clear the kind of marketing, music, promotions, and partnerships he should do to reach that audience. But super careful to do that, but without alienating the core audience. And to not stretch that too far, to like very carefully go after that next audience. And so if you're really clear on who those audiences are, those decisions are much easier, and you make those decisions every single day with which interviews you accept, which emails you reply to, which gigs you do and don't do, and what discount you give people to go on certain, you know, every day you make thousands of decisions. If you're clear in your mind about those audiences, then all those decisions are so much clearer and easier to make. And I watched other famous artists who'd struggled for years and years and years negotiating with the label on something, and then I came in with the audience research showing that it was important. They said, "Oh, okay, we get it. Let's do it then. Fine." But you've been arguing for years about this, and a little bit of clarity on the audience made a decision. So it's magic when it works. When people are clear on their audience, it's magic. And so that's what you've got to try and convince business leaders who've not quite seen that before. You've got to convince them that's possible, and then show them how to get there, which is a journey to go on.
Right. So that was going to be my next question, right? So I think, you know, David Guetta, he at least is coming in with a pretty strong understanding of his audience, right? And that actually kind of shows that, hey, he's relatively sophisticated, that he understands that there's a core audience and then there's another expansion audience, and I got to keep these fans really, really happy, and I can't compromise this base in order to get into the next rung. I don't think a lot of business leaders actually know that much, right, about their audience. So how do you even start, like, you know, with a business, with a brand, to understand who is that core audience? How do you make these decisions not to compromise the core audience for a bigger audience? That can be a really hard business decision to make. So where's that starting point? Like, how do you even start coming up with these different audiences and which ones are important?
Yeah, I think at the heart of it is audience segmentation, which so many people have done. There's a quote by The Economist that I really like. In fact, I put it in our pitch decks, which is that just 14% of executives who had a segmentation thought that theirs was created value for them. That's pretty bad.
Wow.
I think
Wow.
that feels right to me in terms of the market average, right? So everyone's familiar with segmentations. Very few are familiar with them done well.
Yeah.
But at the heart is do it well so that it really makes sense for leadership, and so that there's a now, next, not yet, and never group in there somewhere, so you can play this strategy out. So yeah, audience segmentation done very, very well is the heart of it. But we have a whole slide of 10 different things that leadership has to do after we finish our project if they want the project to have its true impact. So for example, like the leadership need to start using the names of the segments in senior team meetings. And if the members of the leadership team don't use the audience segments terms and use other terms, the CEO needs to call them out on it. Right? How often does that happen at a senior team? Not that
Right.
often. But that
Right.
behavior needs
Yeah.
reinforcing. And if they're not using that language and reinforcing the expectation to use that language at the exec team, how do you think it's happening below, at the levels below? It's definitely not. And so I've seen that done, and it works really well. And I've seen that fail. And you know what? Everybody just forgets about the segments, and the names stop getting used, and it goes away. That's one of 10 steps we have that, I'm sorry, I can't do. You have to do it.
Right.
And we sometimes say to clients when they're asking for a segmentation, we show them this and say, there's so much we can do to make it great. But if you're not willing to do these 10 things,
Right.
there's probably no point in hiring us in the first place.
Right.
So that goes down well.
Yeah. Exactly. It kind of comes back to this point around storytelling, right? That, hey, we can give you a bunch of graphs of an audience segmentation and a bunch of data tables, but what's actually most important is that we name these audiences something and you use that in all of your meetings, because that's how you're going to tell the story about these segments, and that's how you're going to get value out of the research at the end of the day. But I don't want to gloss over the statistic that you mentioned. Only 14% of audience segmentation executives are actually finding valuable. So how do we make sure that we're in the not in the 86? And how do we make sure we're in that 14%? What should we be doing to kind of approach audience segmentation in the right way to make it valuable?
So much to my frustration, after spending about a decade thinking about that question very, very hard, there's no simple answer. There are, in fact, I firmly believe there are 100 or maybe 1,000 micro answers that are all very, very important. And it starts with really boring stuff like, well, it starts with phase zero. Like, if the scope isn't right, there's no hope, right? Also, data quality, questionnaire design. There's about 100 things to get that right. Segment analysis and interpretation, bringing them to life, wrestling with strategic implications. There are about 100 and probably really 1,000 decisions. And the problem is this, I think of it, the process a bit like a chain, from the start to the end. And if any link in that chain is weak or breaks, the whole chain breaks. So even if everything's perfect, but the leadership team don't use the language, there's no point doing the project. It won't work. Everything has to happen. One data quality mistake at the start undermines the entire project. It cannot be fixed. If you survey the wrong audience or you allow fraudulent responses in your survey, everything's ruined. So I think there's a very long list of things that need to be engineered to be great in order to increase that hit rate. And we've worked so hard on engineering that. So minor details, optimizations, templates, processes, all of that stuff. I still think we, as the people conducting the research, I think we only control about half of the variables needed to guarantee success. I say there's 10 major steps that the company has to do. So there's a lot of people got to pull their weight. There's a lot of things that have all got to come together. And so I don't know what I wish I had a quick answer. I don't think there is one.
Is there anything that you've kind of seen, like as you've built on that strategy, that you do more of or less of? Do you kind of say, hey, these days we got to ask 5 times more demographic and psychographic questions because now we have the algorithms to crunch this data in a different way? Or actually all that stuff is making the data dirty and we should simplify the number of demographic questions that we're asking? Is there a different, main kind of exercise or question that you're asking in the survey that kind of ends up being the winning, the kind of win conversion point that allows you to say, yeah, this audience is really strong for this brand versus not? Anything that's kind of evolved over the last kind of 5-10 years that you've seen in the process?
Yeah, great question. And there's been so much evolution in methods, processes, tools, techniques over that time, so much. I think the most important thing, I think, is the dimensions on which you segment. And so for us, that's category related needs is the phrase that we've settled on. So people talk about attitudes or demographics or psychographics or all these different pieces of language. I'm not sure what half of them mean, and they don't mean the same thing to me. They mean to somebody else. I don't know. But category related needs are the things that we've really settled on. So a need, like something that the consumer wants or is trying to do, category related. So let's say you're in you're David Guetta's electronic music. So what's related to electronic music? Well, partying is, and some brands are, and like spending time with your friends is. So they're category related needs. Don't be too tight on defining it around the category, but don't be too broad. It has to be vaguely related to the category. So coming up with a list of category related needs that you use to segment people, like that for us is the absolute foundation. And getting clearer over the last decade about that phrase and about what we mean by that phrase has been foundational. What we do now, though, since ChatGPT is really awesome at understanding people and particularly category-related needs are great, we'll go into the very first meeting with the client with a set of hypothesis category-related needs that ChatGPT has generated for us with our fantastic guidance, of course, and our hypothesis set of segments and actions. We'll go into the very first meeting with that. So we'll say, hey, look, something like this, and we'll improve it during the process. And we're going to output something like this, and we'll validate it and improve it during the process. But if you had this, is that the kind of thing that you could make decisions on and that would be useful to you? That's a conversation that usually takes weeks and weeks and weeks to get. And we go into the very first meeting with it now. It's fantastic.
Wow, this is super valuable. And again, we've got 5 minutes left. I want to dive into some of these, and feel free to ask questions out there. But I think this we're starting to get into some really good tangible advice here, right? So I think first off, the category way of looking at things. I think a lot of people would just say, hey, those are psychographics, but this is actually a different way of thinking about it, right? What are the other categories of time that you're spending, right? How would people categorize what this brand or what this product fits into? And then obviously using ChatGPT to kind of flesh that out, right, and give you a really big head start, because I think that's why people think about these traditional elements, right, demographics and psychographics, because we don't need to generate a bunch of ideas, right? It's like, okay, demographics, these are the 5 things that we ask, right? Age and gender and location. And okay, we know that those questions work and they're there. But categories related to David Guetta, whoa, that takes some brainstorming. That takes some creative energy. Okay, I got to start coming up with those things. How do you use ChatGPT and generative AI to do that? And share with us, if you can, some of the prompts and the ways that you get the AI to kind of do the things that you want it to do.
Great, yeah, absolutely. And I think your point about having to do brainstorming relates to our first conversation about being so very busy. So, okay, I've got to brainstorm that. Great, I'll put it on my to-do list and I'll get around to it on Friday, which doesn't come because you're so busy. Whereas now, right, 1 minute and you've got it from ChatGPT. So, yeah, we would introduce ChatGPT to the category. So let's take David Guetta. So, hey, I'm working with, and he's a name that we recognize. So we use the name. Hey, I'm working with David Guetta. I would start by saying, please describe his music and his audience and his brand, and it would do a pretty good job. That helps to then brief it, so you can use that knowledge that it's explicitly written out. It will use that for the next prompt. The next prompt would be something like, hey, think about audiences who might be interested in, let's take a live show, audiences who might be interested in a live David Guetta show. Please describe 20 deep underlying David Guetta show related needs that might drive different audiences to go to the show for different reasons. That would be a prompt. And you get quite a nice list of 20. We'd editorially curate that list, and maybe they're skewed in one way. So we'd redo the prompts. And no, we're talking about this type. So nudge and guide. We'd probably take 4 or 5 of them out because they're not right. It's not quite what we mean. We might add some in through skills and expertise, rerun it a few times. Okay, get your list of 20. Then we would say, then and only then, we would say, please segment audiences interested in a David Guetta show based on these deep and underlying show-related needs. make each segment distinct and exciting that we could market to in some way, but make each segment want to go for a very different reason so that we can decide which one to prioritize, something like that. And it would come up with these really interesting segments. We would then throw 2 or 3 of them away, reword the prompt, go back again. So there's a lot of iteration here, a lot of skill and judgment. But something like that, and even a rough version of that process will get you something that's very, very good. And it's almost instant.
Wow. I mean, these are some really great practical tips, and I think, great ways to kind of take advantage of these new technologies. I know a lot of people that are still scratching the surface of ChatGPT and generative AI. I think that kind of concept of iteration needs to really be baked in, right? Which is, hey, it's not just one question that you're asking. It's actually a series of questions that build on top of each other, and that's how you actually use AI to its fullest. And I know that you're written a whole book on this, so I definitely want to give people a chance to check that out too. But I think that's one of the. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, to build on what you said, absolutely. And at every step, you curate and edit and refine what it said before. Don't take it at face value. Use your judgment to say, no, that bit of the answer is pretty good. That bit needs to try again, and that bit I'm just going to delete. And something's missing. Let me add it back in. So that real iteration. Oh, somebody's put the URL up. Yeah, I mean, the first thing we did when ChatGPT came out late November, early December, was to say, how can it be helpful to us in doing our job? Because we're lazy? No, because we like democratizing access to the kind of work we do. So from £100,000 projects, we managed to get it down to like 10 or 20,000 research-wise. And then with social media analytics, we managed to get it down to like 5 or 2,000. And then with ChatGPT, we're saying, no, hey, you can now do this in a much cheaper way. We love democratizing access to this stuff. So the first thing we did was to work out what are all the ways that it can help us to do our jobs. And then we just wrote them all down and gave them away.
I love it. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic, David. Just for the audience, I think a few kind of key takeaways that I'm hearing, and there's so much more in this conversation. But first off, don't take the brief as gospel, right? The brief, in some ways, you kind of have to go back to phase 0 and really understand, have that kind of therapist session with the key stakeholders, with the decision makers, and really understand what are the key problems, what are making them tick. I think that's something that we don't do a lot. I think secondly, this notion, right? Hey, segmentation studies are clearly not that successful, right? Only 14% of them are valuable. And I think what David has shared with us here around, thinking of different ways to categorize people, right? It's not just psychometrics, it's not just demographics, but this notion of categories. And then obviously using, this new generative AI to really do that brainstorming process, right? As soon as you've got to come up with these new things, we're all kind of, that's not something we're used to. But I think this is where ChatGPT and generative AI can do so much of the legwork for us. And do check out the book. I know that's going to be on my reading list. There's so much more info there. And I think we've just scratched the surface here. That URL, again, is on the screen there. David, thanks so much for joining the show today. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. The book's pretty cheap, but if you don't feel you've got the money, just message us and I'll send it to you for free. No stress. Thanks, everyone.
Amazing. We got to get the gospel out there. Use ChatGPT more. And thank you, everybody, for attending the show. We'll be off next week, but we'll be coming back on Friday, the 12th of May, to talk with Ruth from Cherry Digital all around how we can use surveys to generate media publications, get media coverage, boost SEO, and tell the content story a little bit better than some folks are doing today. So join us for that next show. David, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.